Okay, so last week we started the new Perek, Perek Bava Metzia, and essentially, whereas Shnaim Oxen dealt with two people or people who were claiming a Metzia, and the question is, although we went into all kinds of different permutations, what would be the outcome of such a sort of dispute if two people who claim the same Metzia? We're now turning to a different focus where you find a Metzia. There isn't two people. There's a finder, a loser, obviously, and a finder. And the halacha, the question here becomes, under what circumstances can you take this Metzia and you don't have to fulfill the mitzvah in the Torah of Hoshev Toshev, that Hoshev Teshivim, that you should, Hashavas Aveda, that you should return a lost object. And that becomes a fine point because people, if you find something, you want to try to return it to its owner, and whether or not you're mechuyev, I mean, you can always go the extra mile, but whether you're mechuyev to do it and how you're mechuyev to do it. So we started last week with a list in the Mishnah on Daf Chof Aleph Amud Aleph. There are certain mitzias findings that belong to the person right away, and these he's responsible to return, and how he returns them, what he does is a question that Gemara will discuss. And the Gemara went through the Mishnah went through a whole series of different possibilities. So we're going to start with the Gemara, and we're going to go one by one, reviewing each one of the points in the Mishnah as to what we do. So here, this is the category of things that you don't have to return; they belong to you. So says the Gemara, "Mata peiros mifuzarim." The first thing the Mishnah talked about was if you found fruits, peiros, meaning obviously objects, but fruits that were scattered on the ground. You're walking along, and you're walking along Arcola, and you come to the almost the intersection of Lamberton, and you see on the ground sprawled a number of beautiful fruits and vegetables. Someone obviously had bought them, and they fell out of a bag or whatever, and they're lying in the street. Respect the Gemara, the kama. What is the measure? In other words, how many fruits? What are we talking about here? Is it just catch can, or is there some system that we or something that we need to hold on to understand this? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, says Rabbi Yitzchak, kav ba'arba amas. If you find a kav, the kav is a measure which is machlokes, whether or not I saw different measures, different halachic measures, whether or not if it's fruit, it could be half a pound, maybe quarters of a pound. I'm not exactly sure where we come down on what a kav is. If it's a liquid, it's in half a gallon or something along those lines. So it's not a huge amount, but there's some chashivas to it. So the question is, if you find those fruits splattered over a kav over dalan amas, arba amas means a 4x4 amas, which is approximately an amma we say is about 2 feet, a little over 2 feet. So let's call it 8x8, and an 8x8 square. You find these fruits scattered. That, says the Mishnah, is peiros mifuzarim, and you don't have to return them. Right. So it says in Marshall, Rashi says, the kama choshev pizor, what's considered spreading, pizor, kav mefuzar ba'arba amas, one kav which is spread over arba amas, aval begimel amas, lo have a pizor. But let's say it was on gimel amas. So Rashi says that's not considered mefuzar. The Talmud meforshel azul, and the Gemara will explain. In other words, it has to be arba amas. That's sort of like a 4 foot, 4x4. Let's call it a 4x4. It has to be that 4x4. Anything less, says the Gemara, would not be considered mefuzar. We'll understand in a couple of minutes when we get to the Gemara. So the Gemara wants to understand how this happened. What's the circumstance? Hey chedam, I derech nefila. If it is because it fell out, a truck was driving by and the fruit fell out of the back of the truck. A person was running and he dropped the bag and was running to the bus and he made the bus and the fruit was scattered over. In other words, if it's a random falling, derech nefila, Afilu tuvinami. Why are you limiting it to 1 kav and 4 amas? If a truck ran by and had fruit in it, and that fruit started spilling out of the truck, and it started spilling over a larger area, more fruit, larger area, whatever. Why are you limiting yourself to one kav in Dalet Amas? If it's nefila, then it's totally random. Then why should that not be considered peres mifuzaris if it's random, right? So the derech hinuach, and if it wasn't random, it was placed, means someone took the fruit and stacked it, or or he put it into 4 piles, 3 piles, 2 piles, whatever. So it doesn't look random, it looks hiniach, as if someone put it down. Afilu botzir mahachanami, low. Even less should be okay. In other words, why is the kamus, the amount, the factor? It should be the way it was found. If it was found derech nefila, which means clearly it's random, then why are you limiting yourself? And if it's found beheniach, if it's found because someone put it down, then why should that? I mean, even less, even if it was 2 fruit or 4 fruit or whatever it was, but it was placed down in stacks. Clearly, someone put it down there on purpose, and he meant to come back. He just maybe he was carrying too much, so he took a couple of fruit and he piled them up in a nice, neat way, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to come back." And anybody who sees it would know that it's not hefker. Remember, the underlying condition of why we're saying that if you find a metzia, you can take it, is because of the concept of yiyush, meaning that if someone loses something, he's miyayish, he gives up. He says, if I lose something in Times Square, no way, no how am I going to find it? I give up, and therefore it's imputed that someone finds something in Times Square, it's going to be miyayish, it's going to be hefker. That's an imputed condition. We're going to see the Gemara is going to talk about that in a minute, how you impute and what you can do there. But let's just say for the moment that peres mefuzaros are yiyush. A truck goes by, drops all this fruit, and the driver maybe doesn't know, maybe he does know, doesn't care. That's yiyush. But someone who stacks fruit in a corner because he wants to come back because he can't carry it all, clearly he wasn't miyayish. He didn't give up. If he didn't give up, then you're not allowed to take it. So the Gemara's kasha is a good one. What are we talking about? You gave me a measure, and we said, okay, that I can live with that measure. Kava arba amos, sounds right. But wait a minute, what happened here? If it was random, why is it limiting? And if it wasn't random, then why is that even a measure that you want to go by? Because you can always say that any amount in any area, a smaller area, a larger area, he clearly meant to keep it. Says Rashi, I derech nefila, imotzam derech nefila sheyesh l'das shelo hunchu sham l'das ela naflu. If it's clear that this fell off something, a person, a truck, the back of a donkey. In other words, there's no pattern to it. Then afilu tuva mekav nami given the Abraham simon yishu miyayish. Since there's no simon, let's say it was over 10 amos, not dollar amos. What difference does it make? And what happens if it was not a kav but 3 kavim? In other words, why is it limited to a kav over dollar amos when it was random? The nuach osid lachshav a little, the little. He will come back and take them. If he comes back and takes them, again, there's no measure that should be the defining, yes, you can, no, you can't take it. Any amount you can't take because he clearly meant to come back. And the whole principle is yish. He clearly wasn't miyayish. If he isn't miyayish, it doesn't matter over what spread, over what area, and how much. So the kasha is a gewaldige kasha, the Gemara asks. I mean, how are you giving me this simon here of kav arba amos, and that's considered the defining the measure? It shouldn't have to do with the measure. It should have to do with how you found it, in what condition you found it. That's the Gemara's kasha. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Ukva bar Chama, says Rav Ukva bar Chama, no, we're not talking about a random falling in the street where he was carrying it and fell. In other words, the circumstance that we posed, basically, that's not the case. It's calling b'machshanta dvei dori. let's say you took your wheat, you brought it to the threshing floor. They had, everybody could bring their produce or whatever it was to a threshing house. And there you could winnow it and thresh it. And everybody came in, did their thing and left, and the next person came. So by appointment, every 15 minutes, every half hour. So what happened here? So says Rashi, Machshata de Dori, B'shas Asifas Goronos, the Kandoshan Baleim, the Nosser Seikir, the Nosser Elu. In other words, this was all staged. A person came in with his produce. He did his thing. They threshed it. He took out the kernels, right? He took the main part. The nasra elu, and this was the chaff or whatever that fell that was left over. So that now the kasha is in with regard to this chaff. What is that? What's considered yish? What's not considered yish? Does the Baal always miyayish every time he finishes threshing and doesn't want it, or can he use it for a filler or for something else? So, in other words, it's the controlled environment. That's the chilek here. It's not hefker outside and where anybody can come. The person who came after him knows it's his. He saw Reuven come out of the threshing floor, and the Shimon goes in. It's not like a confessional where you don't know what's going on. You go in and you say, wait a minute, that's Reuven's. But you look at it and say, wait a minute, this is Reuven's going to want to keep this? I mean, so now the question turns on a whole different Indian. It's no longer random. It's a question of whether what he left over, based on what you saw, was he miyayish or not. So that's that. So then the Gemara says, if that's the case, then we can use a measure. We can say if he left one kavan dalet amas, then that's considered, he doesn't want to bother. Okay, we're going to see the Gemara is going to define it further in a minute. But so random speaking, he doesn't want to bother. But if it's a kav and 3 amas or 4 kav, or in other words, if it's more or less than that particular siman, then there's a question whether he's miyayish. But the Gemara says that the derech klal, a kav and arba amas, a person would be miyayish. And the Gemara is going to explain why he's going to be miyayish in a minute. So now that's the circumstance. It's a controlled situation. It's not that you don't know who the owner is. The question is, can you impute whether or not, based on what you're seeing, he is miyayish, whether Reuven is miyayish because he doesn't want what's there. Okay. So that's now the shayla. So that's what Ukma Bar Chama says. So now, so goes the Gemara weiter and says, Kav ba'arba amas, the nothers terchayu, a kav in 4 amas, that it is a tircha, it's a bother for him to collect. It's too big of an area for him to stoop down and collect. The nothers terchayu, lo tarach inish, lo hada asa v'shakalahu afkura mafkalahu. He's not going to bother. He's not going to bother bending down, up and down to collect these stalks or whatever is left over in a 4 amma area. And again, the Gemara is saying objectively, this is considered a tircha. Maybe for you it isn't, for me it isn't, but generally speaking, that's a tircha. It's a bother to start stooping, picking up these stalks and all of these things in a 4 amma. Now says the Gemara, botzer mehachi, less than four amas, tarach. He will bother. V'hada also v'shakalahu, v'lo mafkalahu. But less than 4 amas, he will bother. So now we've been given a different approach here, that we know everything that's going on. So what's the shaila? The shaila is it a tircha? Is it a bother for him to collect these stalks? And if so, he's not going to bother. Says the Gemara, you know what the objective measure for bothering is? 1 kav in 4 amas. If a person drops 1 kav in 4 amas, that's already the borderline of where he doesn't want to bother. Other than that, you can extrapolate more fruit or less space or vice versa. he may or may not bother. So now that's pshat peiros mifuzaros, right? The Gemara, boy, Rav Yirmiyah. So now, if that's the standard, so now Rav Yirmiyah is going to ask a couple of questions. First, he asks, "Chatzi kav b'shtei amos mahu." Okay, logically, what happens if you cut it in half? It's a half a kav, and it's a 2 amos. Mahu. What's the question? Kav ba'arba amos, 1 kav and 4 amos tamamai. Why is it hefker? Mishum de nafesh tirchei, because a person finds it to be a bother. Chatzi kav b'shtei amos, kiven lo nafesh tirchei lo mafkalahu. Is he going to be mafker? Is he going to make hefker a half a kav in dalet amos? What's the question? The question is, when a person doesn't want to bother with a kav and 4 amos because it's too hard for him, is it equally hard if the space is less and the amount is less? All he has to do is deal with 2 kav, not 4. 2 amos, not 4 amos. 2 amos is manageable. But wait a minute, it's not a kav, it's only a half a kav. So the question is, if you can collect a half a kav and 2 amos and maybe scoop it up once or twice, maybe it's not a tircha. That's the kasha. That's what Ram is asking. In other words, what are we going to extrapolate from a kav and 4 amos? Are we going to say that a half a kav and 2 amos is okay because it's not a tircha? Oh, or maybe not. Dilma mishum delo chashivi has nothing to do with tircha. Maybe that answer that 1 kav in 4 amos is a tircha, is a bother, has nothing to do with the work. It has to do with the chashivas. In other words, 1 kav is not choshev. It's not worthy of spending the time, let's just say. So a half a kav, certainly not, right? So if it's not chashivi, the chatzi kav b'shtei amos given the chashivi mafkalahu. In other words, the question now becomes, what is the reason why 1 kav in 4 amos is not worthy, let's call it? Is it because the work is too hard, or because the amount of produce is not sufficient to make a big deal? So that's the kasha. So now when you have a half a kav in 2 amos, what's the answer? We can't just say automatically divide it by 2 and it should be the same. That 1 kav and 4 is considered hefker. A half a kav and 2 is considered hefker. You can't just say that because you don't know the reason why 1 kav in 4 is not. Is it because it's too much work, or because it's not important enough to take the time to collect the kav? So if you have a half a kav and it's 2 amos, that's not hard work. I can do that. But if a kav isn't chashuv, then a half a kav certainly isn't chashuv. Meaning, if a kav isn't worth taking the time, if you won't go after a pound of cherries that fell down, why would you bother with a half a pound? Half a pound, it's only in a smaller area, maybe I'll do it. This is the kasha. So what's the reason behind kav v'arba amos? Ask the Gemara. So Tzukar Rashi, nafesh terchaya lekaptzan, to gather them. Batzeli hachi imhaya pezurim b'pokas mikan. So maybe yes, or mishum delo chashivi olea kav peres l'tzerach olea toirach kibud shel arba amos. Or maybe we say no, it has nothing to do with the area. It has to do with the chashivus of a kav. It's not worth it for him to go after a kav in these 4 amos. But if it's in less than 4 amos, maybe he would. So this is the Gemara's kasha.
All right, a question.
Yeah.
So, and I learned this Gemara many years ago, and I don't remember any of it. So hardly any of it. So maybe this is answered later.
Good. It's a tabula rasa. You're brand new.
Yeah. The issue here of the importance of the amount versus the area versus the work involved makes a lot of sense. But here's the key, the other possible key, which is this is area. Whether you're looking at this as either a circle with a diameter of Dalet Amos, or you're looking at it as a square of 4 by 4 amos. Either way, as you're increasing or decreasing 2 amos to 8 amos, etc., the gathering area goes up or down by the square. And so, a half a kav in 2 amos is, let's say if it's an actual square rather than circle, it's simpler, is 4 square amos to work with, versus for a half a kav versus 1 kav of 16 square amos. It's that, and so on up when you go to 8 and so on. That makes a bigger difference than just the absolute amount of it's going to take me 1 minute, 2 minutes, etc., because you're going up or down by the square of the area in terms of the work involved.
So are you asking whether or not there is a chiluk between what the configuration of the space was? Is that the
well
question?
I'm saying that whether we determine, and I don't know if the Gemara discussed
I think
whether
typically the Gemara thinks of a square. I think
okay,
typically
but either way, whether it's a square or a circle, either way, the point is that you go from the difference between 4 amos and 2 amos is going to change by the square of that raw simple 1 number measurement.
Right.
Whereas the amount of fruit that we're talking about, we're going by just the value, x versus x squared. And so the time required to, let's say you're vacuuming a floor, the time required to vacuum a 4 amos square floor is going to be 4 times as much as it takes to vacuum the 2 amos square floor, because it's going up or down by the square.
So if that's the case, then that's a gaval. Then that really enforces the question, because if it's going to take so much longer to do 4 than 2, then maybe 2 is not even a tircha. Maybe 2 is a quick.
That could be. I mean, 2 right. From a very practical standpoint at this level, 2 is enough that the average person could just kneel down, wouldn't have to walk anywhere.
Right. Okay. So there you go. So 2 is quite simple. 4 becomes complicated. And the
8, which is the next, is even more.
Is even more, right? But then the question is a kav even worth bending for 2? Let's say it was a kav.
It's a half a kav worth bending for 2.
A half a kav is even less, right? So this is why we're stretching this question in all different directions to get an understanding of why they picked a 1 kav in Dalet Amos. Did it have to do with the work involved or the chashivas of the fruit? That the fruit wasn't chashiv, in which case less, even in a tiny area, it's not worth it. It's not dignified enough for him to bend down and do it, let's say. Whereas if it wasn't a question of chashivas, baltashkes, he didn't want to leave anything in the ground. But you know what? Dalet Amos is a little hard for me to bend and to do, but 2 amos I can bend. So it may have been a practical question because he was an older person and it was hard for him to do it. But if it was chashiv enough, he would try to do it. If it wasn't chashiv, he wouldn't bother at all. I mean, I can tell you that, we all have this experience. When you go in the street and you see like an Adam chashiv, a Rosh Yeshiva, someone, whoever, walking the street, and there's a $50 bill, he's not picking up that $50 bill. I assure you. It's chashiv. It doesn't pass. It's not chashivas. If his back hurts him, he won't bend for 50. The point being is that you really have to evaluate what we're talking about to have an appreciation of why the Gemara objectively picks a kav in Dalet Amos. It wasn't just min hashamayim. I mean, there had to be a reason why that was considered a thing. So we'll get to the understanding or not. I have to warn you, but to your point, Menashe, you're right. So now we've said if it's a half, what do we do? Now, what about we flip it around and we say, the Shmona Amos Mahu. Now, what happens if you double it and you have 8 Amos in the area? Kav ba'arba Amos. Then we say Kav ba'arba Amos, 1 Kav and 4 Amos. Tamaman mishum denofish terchayu, because it's a tircha to bend down and do Dalet Amos. But kolshkein kabayim b'shmona Amos. Certainly, even if it's double the produce in 8 Amos, given the nafshe tircha tfei mafkalahu, like you just said, Menashe, it's geometric. Maybe in 8, it's not just 8 versus 4, now you have to quadruple it, and it's that much more space. So even though it's 2 kabayim, which could be very, very chashuv, but what am I going to bend down over 8 amas? Am I kidding? I won't get up. So in other words, the tircha is even greater, odilma or not, mishum delo chashivi. You're going to say because it has to do with chashivas, the kabayim, the shmona amas. Given the chashivi, lo mafkalahu. Are you kidding? Kabayim? I'm not going to let kabayim go to waste. Kabayim is such a chashuv measure that I'm going to go who knows where to collect it. So it makes no difference that it went from arba amas to 8 amas. So that's the question.
Rabbi, are you assuming that the person is walking, or is he riding on a carriage, or what?
Well, the assumption is that you mean the finder.
No, the loser, the one who loses it.
The one we lose is, you know what? For our discussion, let's just say, I mean, it's not really relevant, but let's just say that remember, we're talking now, the Gemara defined it, we're no longer talking about an abstract person walking, running, driving in the street. We're talking about a case of the threshing floor. So we have a confined area. It's a confined area.
You're not.
And he comes in and he saw that Reuven finished his threshing and he left 2 kav worth of fruit in this large area of 8 amas. So the question is, what am I going to do with this? Am I going to not bother because it's too large of an area for me to start bending and picking up these sheaves of chaff of the sheaves of grain? Or am I going to say, this is like the person who collects bottle caps? You know, I'll bend up and pick up a bottle cap wherever I find it, and sure, I'm going to pick it up. It's chashuv. It's this stuff is usable. So that's the scenario. I mean, in the earlier scenario, we just said it was totally hefker. It was out there on the street. Then the Gemara asked the Kasha, okay, if it's out there on the street, then why are we even bothering? Why are we even bothering? It has nothing to do with the size. It has to do with how you find it. If you find it strewn around, hefker. If you find it piled, not hefker. Simple. But when you're talking about a threshing floor where everything just lies around, there is no, in other words, it's not a question of derech hanicha. He didn't take all of the sheaf and pile it neatly in a pile along the side, which showed that the next guy should do his thing but not bother with that. It's strewn all over the threshing floor. And you are now the next person to come in and you see that there. And based on what you see, you can define whether or not it's considered hefker or not. So that's a different approach.
One more point, which is so you were using here as an example, saying, oh, he sees Reuven had just left and there was a stuff, etc. But actually, if I understand this correctly, we're talking here really about a situation we have no idea who it is, because the whole question of whether you have to announce it. Because if you actually knew, beyond a reasonable doubt this was Reuven's, you'd be obligated to tell Reuven. Yeah,
absolutely. You're right, Menashe. So in other words, if you knew it was Reuven, then you should go to Reuven and say, Reuven, what do you want to do with this stuff? No, that's correct. So you're right that we don't. He came a half hour later. He doesn't know who used it, and all of the stuff was lying on the ground, and so he has to make an assumption: is the guy coming back? Is the guy not coming back? Good point. So the Gemara is giving us sort of an outline and saying, depending on your point of view, Gemara, in other words, if you hold it's tircha, then clearly there's a tircha here. But if you hold chashivas, then maybe this fruit at kabayim is chashiv, or maybe, and in the case of the lesser, then maybe it's not a tircha. So all these questions come into play, you're right. And now the Gemara wants to know, what do we do? So we're not finished yet. Gemara is going to give us yet another example to raise our awareness of what the issue is. Kav shumshamin. It's a different product. Shumshamin is kind of like seeds.
Sesame
seeds. Kav shumshamin, sesame seeds. Ba'arba amas mahu. What's the chashivas? because obviously sesame seeds was a more choshuv item than this lay a stalk of grain. So now the Gemara is honing in a little bit more on this question and saying, no, it wasn't just a random stalk. A kab shumshum ba'arba amas mahu. Do we say kab ba'arba amas tamamai mishum delo chashivi v'shumshumin given the chashivi lo mafkalu? So now we're already talking about chashivas. A regular stalk is mechashiv. Shumshumin is chashiv. Therefore, the chashivas is what is important. Oh, Dilma mishum the nafesh terchaya. It's about tircha. The kolchkem shumshumin kim the nafesh terchaya tzvei. Tiny little seeds. Can you imagine? Someone has to go around start. It's one thing to collect, let's say, the chaff of a stalk of wheat, which may have some substance that you could hold on to. Did you ever try picking up a grape, or did you ever try picking up a tiny little seed? So a grape you can pick up with your finger and pick it up. The seed, you kidding? You have to start taking your finger and see if it's wet enough to go on your finger to put it up. At least for me, when I have these little things on the ground, I have to take my finger, wet my finger, and then go poking on the ground to pick up every tiny little piece, because there's no way to pick them up. So the shumshumin, now you really have a stark contrast between chashivus and tircha. Very chashuv, but very tircha, very much Torah.
Actually, even more so, because back then most floors were not concrete or wood.
Right.
They were packed dirt.
Dirt.
And packed dirt. If it's a grape, you pick it up, you rinse it off, you're done. The seeds they get embedded in the dirt very easily.
Dirt, even more so. Correct. So now you're talking about a tircha. Now you really have a tircha. So again, this kasha assumes a slightly different variation, because the dichotomy between chashivas and tircha is far greater, let's say, by shumshumin than it is by a regular piece of grain. So again, he's asking the kasha. Now we have one more variable. Kav tamre, tomorim, dates, ba'arba amas, kav rimone ba'arba amas, or rimonim. Mahu. Why? What's the question? Because dates and rimonim are bigger. They're easier to pick up. So now we're going the other extreme. Shumshumin is chashivas, but very hard to pick up. Kav ba'arba amas tamamai, mishum delo chashivi, kav tamre ba'arba amas, kav rimonim ba'arba amas, nami kim delo chashivi maftalahu. It's not that chashiv. In other words, they must have had tons of dates, tons of rimonim. So losing a date or a couple of rimonim isn't a big deal. It's not that chashiv. It's not that valuable that he's going to run after it. So in other words, you have the opposite of what a shumshumin is. Odilma mishum the nafesh terchaya. It has to do with tircha. The kaf tamre ba'arba amas, the kaf rimon ba'arba amas, kibbul the nafesh terchaya lo mafkalu. What's the big deal? You pick up, you can scoop up a half a dozen tomorim or rimonim in one bend. So you bend twice and you pick them all up. In other words, it's not a case of getting on all fours and starting to pick up little shumshumin or chafes of wheat. So the Gemara gives us 4 different examples, all of which have a different variable than the principle of kav ba'arba amas. And the Gemara asks Akasha, so what's the halacha if you find tamarim, shumshumin, rimonim, etc.? So answers the Gemara, teku. So the Gemara says teku. I don't have the answer. So now we have to think about that for a minute. What's pshat teku? In other words, the shaila is such that when we lay down, normally when you lay down sort of the black letter of the law, which is what we call it, the halacha is this. The halacha is clear. This is the halacha. And we can extrapolate from the halacha all kinds of permutations, combinations. Here, in this Gemara, the Gemara, it's again, maybe there was a rhyme or a reason, but if I'm looking at this and I'm asking myself, kav ba'arba amas, where does that come from? In other words, why just a kav? Again, and you can speculate any way you want. So the Gemara lays down kav ba'arba amas. Okay, it sounds reasonable, but then when you start thinking about it, it doesn't have the clout, if you will, to say that it's so distinguished, it's so clear that any variation can be, you can extrapolate any variation from it. You see that you can't, because there's, again, the Gemara is unclear of the reason why Kav Ba'arba Amis. So we talk about Tircha, we talk about Chashivas. So the Gemara's questions are really valid questions. In what direction are you going? You're going Chashivas, up the scale, down the scale of Chashivas. Okay, I understand. And if you go Arba Amis, it's the same question. How much in a scale of Arba Amis is a person going to, in other words, if you walk in the street and you see coins, right? Sometimes a person walks, maybe he has a hole in his pocket, he had a lot of quarters, dimes, nickels, and you start walking. I know for me, random. I mean, clearly, if I find a quarter in the street, it's not going back to anybody else. But if you see a quarter and then your eye catches a dime 6 inches away and another quarter, you're going to follow the trail. You're going to start looking. I mean, normally, unless you got to be somewhere in a minute. Wait a minute, what's all this change doing on the ground? And all of a sudden, you're going to walk in a circle and you're going to see tons of coins. What would let's say the regular person do? Regular person, okay, if you don't care, you don't care. But you say, wait a minute, there's money here. But by the time I finish, it may be real money. And you start picking up all this money. How far are you going to go? Are you going to go from the corner of Lambert and Arcola all the way up to Monticello? You're going to go a block? How far are you going to go? And wait a minute, if it's pennies, I may say, you know what? Someone dropped rolls of pennies. I'm not taking the time to pick up pennies. So in other words, you have to ask yourself that question. The chashivas, the area involved. So that's the same thing. Talk about coins today. I mean, we're going to talk about moles. So okay, but in other words, fruit, coins. We're talking about things that don't have identity that you find. What's the halacha? So the Gemara, okay, it's not a satisfying answer, but it tells us that there is a certain randomness to this, and we can't figure it out. Shumshimin dakin ma'od, very, very small or thin. V'yesh tayrach b'kibbutz and yosim nechitten, and it's much more difficult. Aldaneim yikarin, but sesame is much more expensive. Tamar and Merimonim, the other way around, gas and hain, they're very big. Vein tayrach b'kibbutzim, but on the other hand, they're not terribly expensive either. So the Gemara leaves us with this question, and we can extrapolate. And so it's a good kasha. Now, so just to point out, the bottom thesis on the bottom of the daf asks a very interesting question, and the question is, if we say a kav ba'arba amas, you cannot, it is considered, no, you're not going to bother, right? So the kasha here is within that kav and arba amas, not a separate case of chatzi kav and 2 amas. If we're saying that, if we're taking the position that a person would collect a half a kav and davar amas, then why are you telling me that a kav ba'arba amas he wouldn't collect? Maybe he would collect a half a kav in that arba amas. In other words, he'd collect the half a kav in 2 amas of the kav and arba amas. You understand? In other words, you're making a blanket statement that kav ba'arba amas he wouldn't collect. But on the other hand, you're saying a half a kav in 2 amas he might collect. Then he might collect a half a kav in 2 amas of that arba amas. So why are you telling me the kav arba amas is not valid, is not considered, it's hefker? Why? Maybe he'll collect a half within the arba. You understand? The kasha is, why are you making this blanket statement? You can't make a blanket statement because maybe the half in the half in the 2 he will collect. That's Taisus' just sort of out of the box question is Tema. He says Hakava arba amas hanami chatzi kav within kava arba amas there is chatzi kav in 2 amas and maybe he'll collect it. It's kind of an interesting question. Taisus answers by saying that it's not likely. This is an interesting question. It's not likely that if there's a kav and arba amas that he would stoop down to collect the half and 2 and walk away. In other words, he either will or he won't. It's either a tircha or not a tircha. In other words, it's not likely that he'll just take the half in the 2 and leave the other half in the 2. That doesn't make sense, says Tosfos. Either he's going to collect it or not. We're saying a kav ba'arba amas he won't collect. So we leave it at that. If he happens to find a half in 2, nothing to do with 4. He happens to find a half a kav in 2. Question, is it worth his picking up? But picking up a half and 2 from 1 in 4, says Tosfos, that's not likely. A person won't do that. So it's just a different, in other words, he asks the kasha and he gives himself a teretz by saying that's not human nature. Human nature, if they're going to pick it up, they'll pick the whole thing up. If they're not going to pick it up, they're not going to pick up half of it either. So but it's an interesting thought that Tosfos wants to raise. Anyway, so Teku, says the Gemara, we don't have an answer, and basically we have to move on and leave it to the good graces of the Eliyahu Navi to come and give us the answer as to what the distinction is. Now, we're going to turn it into Tav Aleph on the base, and we're going to talk now about a concept that is a huge concept in the Gemara, and that is Yir Shalom Midas. You remember that we said many times in the beginning of the Masechta, in the first parak, that's Chusel Shel Adam Shelo B'fanav. What does that mean? That means for something that is a benefit to a person, that a person can acquire it without it being in front of him, or without him knowing. What did we say? We say, for instance, if a person, a shaliach on behalf of a person, as an example, comes across something that can benefit his balabos, the mashulach, then he can make a kinyan on behalf of the balabos without the balabos even knowing that it's going on, because chusun shel adam shaloi b'fanav, a benefit, a positive, a schus, we impute that everybody wants a schus. So if I empower you to be my shliach, and you happen to be my shliach and come across something that can benefit me, and you do it for my behalf, I won't reject it. Okay, that's the concept. Now, this Gemara, different concept, but equally, interesting question. Yir Shaloi Midas. Is there such a thing as Yush without a person knowing? We're saying that the whole principle of this Gemara that we're talking about, why all these things make sense, is because of the concept of Yush. Will a person abandon the ownership of this if he knows this? In other words, if he would, let's say I'm driving a truck and all this fruit starts falling out. I don't know that it's falling out. I'm driving the truck, but it's falling out and all over the place. Do you impute to me, the driver, Yiyush? I know nothing. I don't know that I dropped it. Do you impute to me Yiyush or not? That's the question. Itmar, we learned, this is, Itmar is an interesting statement because Itmar automatically means that it's not the Tanoim, but it's the Amaroim. So it's a concept all over the Gemara, Itmar. Just it's a little tidbit because Itmar always refers to a machlokes in the Gemara, never in the Mishnah. Yir Shalom Midas. If a person is Miyai Shalom Midas. So let's look at Rashi. Yir Shalom Midas Dover Shestomo Yir L'Kishiyada. It means that a person would be miyayish if he knew. He doesn't know. But if he knew, he would be miyayish. Shenofel mimenu, that it fell from him. When somebody goes ahead and finds it, the Baal never knew that he lost it. So that's called Yir Shaloi Midas. And there's a lot of discussion on this. It says Abaya, Lo Hava Yish. It's not Yish. So the Gemara, the common first plukta. We're going to get into the underpinning of the machlekes. But Abaya says Yish can't happen if a person doesn't know. That's his principle. Rava Amar Haba Yish, and Rava says there is Yish. So what's the real machlekes? The machlekes is whether we impute Yish in a circumstance where if the person would have known, would he be miyayish? So in the case of fruit that fell off the truck, or let's say, or in the threshing floor, all these circumstances we talked about. Well, in the threshing floor might be harder because maybe he knows that it's on the ground. So let's talk about a case where he doesn't know anything. He's on the truck and it falls out. So Abaye would say, no, he can't be miyayish because he doesn't know. And Rava says, we impute yish because there's no way if he knew, he would be anything but miyayish. Okay, so now the Gemara has to understand what's the discussion. Says the Gemara, in a case where there is a siman to the lost object, in other words, you can't impute yish to something that has a siman. So if it has a siman, a person will always say, oh, I can reclaim it. In his mind, he won't give up because he has a siman, right? And we know that a siman is something that, as we said in that Mishnah, and we'll talk more, is something that makes it unusual for him, and he knows it. Now, what does that mean? That even though at the end, when the story is over, we'll know that he was miyayish. Okay, fast forward to the end of this episode, right? We can say with clarity, this person is miyayish, because at the end, there's no way that he will find it, right? So there's no question that he will be miyayish. So va'afagav the shman the miyayish l'sof lo haviyish says, do we say that there's like a baya lo haviyish dechi also liyadi b'yasurahu de also liyadi the lechiyada the nafal minei lo miyayish neima omar simona isle begave yahav nesimna v'shekilna lahu. So in other words, so we're talking here by a dover that has a siman, right? And we're saying, so what's the argument? The argument is that when it fell, he didn't know anything about it. So fast forward to the end, if he had known, then he would have been miyayish, because would he have been miyayish? Why? Because he would abandon and say, no, there's no way I could have recovered it. So the principle is that even though at the end we would know for certain that he was miyayish, at the time it happened, we can't say that he was miyayish, and therefore the person who found it be'isa. He found it improperly. In other words, it can't be his, because there was no yish. Even though we know at the end of the story he would be miyayish, at the time it happened, we don't know that he was miyayish. That's what it. So va'afal gav deshman the miyayish l'sof. Even though at the end of the story, at the end of this whole finding, we know that he was miyayish, lo haviyish, it still is not yish. Because when at the time that he got it, it was iser. The leka, why? Because when the owner actually finds out that he lost it, lo miyayish. Siminahi begabe. He said, I have a siman. I'll bring the siman and I'll collect it. So that's pshat in Abaye. That's Abaye's thinking, is that you can't say that it's yiyush, because until he knows with certainty, even though he doesn't know, he will always think, oh, I can get it back. So that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Lo have yish, the miyayish lebesof, la'acher shemotzu zeh, b'chola the yish, kiven, oma, vave lelechisorin kis, the gole date shenosa behen, b'yisura also liyade, the davar she'ena also lehisyayishu, because it's not something that a person would be miyayish. So if he wouldn't be miyayish, even if at the end it turns out he clearly will be miyayish, he will give up, we don't say that we impute yish at the time of the finding. So that's Abaya's thinking why you can never say yish, even though it's something that he clearly will be miyayish later on. Okay, it's an interesting way of putting it, but that's Abaya's thinking as to why it is yish. So that's the Gemara Azar. What happens, bezuta shel yam? What happens in the case where you're walking along the beach, let's say, and you drop an object, okay? It may have a siman on it. And what happens in the Zuta Shel Yam? The Zuta Shel Yam says Rashi, Mukomas b'shafas hi shederech hayam lachzo la'achrov yud parsos or chamisha osa parsos pamayim biyom. So the Rashi is telling us the principle of high tide. The principle of high tide is that you walk on the beach and it's near the water and you drop it. And at some point in the day, that water is going to come all the way up to the object, v'shotef, ma shemotzer shom v'holech, and it will grab whatever is there and go back into the water. And he says, Zutza loshen gadol v'shivua b'loshen yivani, k'moshe kosva zakenim, v'talmei hamelech, v'alalitza v'al. In other words, so you're dropped something, and the tide will come in and wash it out to the water. So that's pshat. You know that your object is no longer on the beach. You know it's somewhere in the water. Or the overflowing of the banks of a river, right? After a huge rain and the water swells and it starts spilling all over the place, and you left your shoes or something expensive by the edge of the water. You come back and it's not there because you see water all over the place, so you know what happened. The water took it away. Afalgaf the ispe simen, even though there's a simen, those shoes were unique. That pendant that you dropped on the beach was unique. You could pick it out anywhere. Rachmona Sharyeh, Rachmona meaning the Baruch the Torah allows it. Rachmona Sharyeh, clearly, you're not getting that back. It has a siman. I'm not miyayish. The teretz is that you know you're going to be miyayish at the end. If you knew when you dropped the pendant that the tide was going to come in and take it and bring it out, you'd clearly be miyayish. I mean, I've dropped something. I mean, we all have, but I've dropped something by the edge of a beach, and I really felt badly, and I come back and I don't see it. So either someone picked it up and took it, or where I left it, the water took it away. Either way, I'm not getting it back. So in my own mind, okay, I already was miyayish. I felt bad, but I was miyayish. Now, someone may have found it. Okay, the question is, at the time he found it, was I miyayish? I wouldn't be miyayish on a diamond pendant. I didn't know. It fell off my, a diamond ring, a pendant, whatever. It fell off in my pocket. It was on my shirt, my wife's shirt, and it fell off. I wouldn't be miyayish. I'd search hand and foot. But soft at the end, I'm clearly miyayish because there's no question that I lost it and I'm not finding it. So this is the question in those circumstances, whether or not there was no yish at the time that it fell, because clearly you didn't know. You left it on the beach and you thought, okay, fine, I'll come back and get it. So that he says there's no machlekes. Even Abaya would admit that there is yish. Ki pligi b'davar she'ein bo siman. In reverse psychology, the machlekes between Abaya and Rava is not where there is a siman and you lose the object And at the end, there's no way you could possibly not be miyayish. He's telling us that in that case, Abaya would agree to Rava, that there's yish. When is the machlekes? The davar she'ein bo siman. When there is no siman. What's pshat the ein bo siman? Abaya says very plainly, Lo have a yish, the hall lo yoda the nafel minei. He didn't know he lost it. So in his mind, he was not miyayish. What is yish? Yish is a state of mind. It isn't something you can put your hand on. Your mind tells you, I give up. I lost this, not finding it. It's a state of mind. Abaya says, if you don't know you lost it, your state of mind can't articulate, I give up, because you don't know. Rava Amahava Yish, Rava says it is Yish, Rava takes a step further. Rava says, what's human nature? We understand human nature. Okay, you don't know. But if you knew, you wouldn't have a havamina that it isn't lost. So Rava is saying, Abaye is, in other words, is the hardliner. He's saying, you don't know, you can't be miyayish, because yish is a state of mind, and your mind wasn't ready to accept it. Rava says, understood. But if you would have known, you clearly would have been miyayish. So Rava is saying that your state of mind is imputed. We impute in your state of mind a yish that you clearly would have given up. That's the fundamental machlokes. He says to himself, Simona Leslie begabe, right? I don't have a siman. Mehashtahu de miyayish. So from here on out, I'm miyayish, because I don't have a siman. I don't have a havamin. I'm going to get this back. So in other words, it's an imputing of that year. Let's take a look at Rashi. Shalusa shalnor kishu godel, when it gets big, the yotze chutz legadosa, it goes outside of his boundaries. The sholel the shotef hanimsa, and so basically it sweeps everything away. And I mean, you're again very stark. You're in Niagara Falls, and you're watching the falls, and it's beautiful and everything. And then you're standing on one of those platforms, and then you drop your camera, and you see your camera falling in. Are you going to be miyayish? I mean, there's no havamina that you're going to get it. Now, what happens if you're with a whole bunch of people in your family, and your camera slips out of your pocket, and all of a sudden you want to take a family picture, and you put your hand in your pocket, and there's no camera, and you start looking around. You say, "Whoa, my camera! Did I leave it in the car? Where did I go?" You're not miyayish because you have no havamina to be miyayish, right? If you would have known it fell into the falls, you would have said bye. There's no question. So here is that machlokes. Abaye says you don't know, you can't be miyayish. Now, what happens if someone is in the Maid of the Mist boat, and that camera falls into the boat, and he sees this beautiful Nikon camera at his feet and says, "Whoa, where did this come from?" Okay, so can he keep the camera? According to Abaye, he can't keep the camera. Now, he doesn't know anything, of course, but Rava says, of course you can keep the camera. You look around and you say, where did this come from? Well, whoever, it obviously belonged to somebody. It didn't come in a Shemayim, but clearly no one is going to claim this camera. It's sitting here in the middle of Niagara Falls, and I happen to be in the boat where it fell. But Abaye takes the view that, you know what, it's not Yiyush. Now, what are you going to do with the camera? I mean, you're going to go to the lost and found in Niagara Falls and say, I found a Nikon camera. But Lamaisa, in a practical sense, Abaye is telling us there was no Yiyush. So this is the epitome of the machlokes. Clearly, we can see the sides, and we can sort of understand maybe Abaye, but we can certainly understand Rava, that what Rava is saying is that a circumstance that if at the end of the story, if someone tells the guy, you know what, your camera just fell out of your pocket into Niagara Falls, he'll say, okay, forget about it, lost that one. There's no question that he would agree that it was Yiyush, But since B'Shas Maisa he didn't know it was Yish, Abaye takes the position it's not Yish. That's really, you can argue, maybe say that that's a little bit, not reasonable. But again, Abaye says that's the point. Rachmana Sharia va'afilo bos liyah hamaitzi l'fnei Yish. Now, the Rachmana, the Torah is telling us that even if it came to the finder before Yish, it clearly has to be Hefker, it has to be Yish, because there's no way it can be recovered. The common Bishmaitzen, Minyan Laveda Sheshut Fanah. We're going to talk about Aveda that the Nahor grabbed. So Mahashta have a year, Shahari Nafal, Kushiyoda Shuv, and Data Olaf. So it's clearly Yish, because when he would find out, he would right away say, there's no question that this is not recoverable, right? Daveda Midas, Shalom Naflu Mimenu, Umidas. Okay, so that's the next one. Okay, so now we have the clear contrast in the Gemara between Abaye and Rava as to whether Yish Shalom Midas have a Yish. Abaye says Lo have a Yish because in the instant that it was found there was no Yish, and I can't allow someone to be Miyayish. And the Gemara goes back and forth and says, well, are we talking about with a simon, without a simon? And the Gemara basically concludes that we're talking about without a simon, but if you can't impute years to someone who doesn't know that it was Miyayish. So I think we'll stop here, because the whole rest of the Gemara is a series of Toshmas that try to prove Rava or try to prove Abaye. So we really have to go in these in a series, and it's the rest of the dots. So it'll take quite a bit of time. So we'll stop here. But the principle of Yir Shaloi Midas, which is a major principle in the Torah, is one. I mean, you could take either side. You could say that it makes sense, but Abaye is being a strict constructionist and is saying Yish can only apply when you actually have Yish. And Rav is saying that there's something that we can impute as Yish. Just as that's why I introduced the concept of Schusha Shalom Shaloi B'Fanav, something that is positive, you can do Shaloi B'Fanav. Remember, we said something that is negative, you can't do Shaloi B'Fanav. So now the question is, this is a negative, right? Because you lost something. So the question is, in this negative, is there, because Yish is the principle, not just that it's a bad thing for the Baal. A bad thing for the Baal, clearly you can't do Shalom B'Fanav. He has to agree. But since it's something that is not recoverable, so then that's that gray area in the middle of whether or not a person would agree that it's not recoverable. But Abaye says, as long as he doesn't know, you can't impute in him. And by the way, this goes somewhat, Abaye's theory goes somewhat against the grain of most of the Gemaras that we talk about, because the Gemara does impute things into events. In other words, there are times that we impute, again, depending on the circumstance, we do impute in someone that this would be the outcome. The question here is that Abaye is saying, going further and saying, it's not just an event or something on the outside. It's something, b'machshava, something in his mind. Can we get into his mind and say that what he's thinking clearly would be this or not? And that's where Abaye draws the line. He says, yes, I understand that outside of the world, there are things that you have to impute, because otherwise, we lock ourselves in. So the halacha has to have that flexibility to say there is an assumption. But why should I make an assumption when it comes to someone's own machshava, where in his mind, he has a choice? There's a brayer. He could say, there may be someone who loses a very expensive article and can't get his mind around the fact that he doesn't have it. I mean, yes, the normal person would say this is lost, but what happens if a person says, I'm going to go to the end of the earth and I'm going to find it. I don't care if it lands in China. I'm going to go there. I mean, there is such a Metzias, not likely, but so then there's no Yish. So if someone turns up with the item and he says that's mine, and you go to Bezdin says there's Yish, Says, I was never miyayish. I believe that I would find this item. And that is a metzias. That can happen. In which case, you have a lawful question. Can you impute yish into someone in a circumstance where everybody rove? 99% of the people would say, the ocean has it. It's somewhere in the middle of the ocean. I'll never find it. So that's a halachic question, which I'm sure is discussed. I mean, I can look further, but that would be a question of whether or not someone could go against the grain, against what would be normal yish, and say, I'm not miyayish. So a biased position is not totally unreasonable. I mean, it's not the norm, but it's not unreasonable where he says, if a person doesn't know he can't be miyayish, maybe this person has the insight to say, I'm going to find it. So anyway, I'll look at that further, but this is the major clash in which, when we go further, we'll see how the different Gemaras that the different incidences that the Gemara brings down, he tries to prove like Rava or proves like Abaye, and it goes back and forth. So it's a very fascinating piece.
The case that you gave where somebody on the boat at the bottom of the falls found the camera, he could say to himself, that's a very unusual event. Does not happen very often. I could identify the person who lost the camera. That, I mean, it might be Lifnim Mishur Hadin,
Right.
but he certainly, in the spirit of the Torah, as expounded, he would say, if I can identify the owner, because it must have just happened, and there is a limited number of people up there, I'm bound to do that.
Well, but you're right, because the mitzvah Havashavas Aved is midaraisa. So, and the deraisa, you don't take it lightly. Now, if it's a needle in a haystack, the question is how far you have to go with the mitzvah. If you can somehow, yes, you're right. In that particular day, there were 1,000 people who were at the fall. So it's not unlimited number. And maybe there's a way of saying this is a very expensive item, and someone in that 1,000 people will not be miyayish. You're right. So that becomes an interesting question.
And there is a simon.
And there is a simon, right? So that will become the question of whether or not how far we go with Hashavas Aveda Midaraisa as to whether or not there is a mitzvah here. But again, this machlokes, maybe that example was a little too can be you can expect, maybe you can find it in that example. So maybe the example wasn't the best example, because maybe you can. Not likely, but maybe you can. But when we're talking about something here that's belize simon and it's washed away, how will someone know that I have a Longines watch like a million other Longines watches? What's my watch going to be? Let's say it is found. I mean, how am I going to identify my watch over anybody else? Has no simon, and it was washed away by the river. Go find it, right? So, but it's interesting because Abaye Lishitoso that yes, he's going to be miyayish later, but B'shas Maisa he wasn't miyayish. Clearly, he would have been miyayish later. If you asked him, this is the story, would you be miyayish? He says, no question, I'd be miyayish. But at the time that it happened, he didn't know. Abaye says he can't be miyayish. Rabbi says, of course he can be miyayish. Yesh shalom medas, have a years. But Abaye says no. So anyway, that's the core of the machlokes. But you're right, David. To the extent that a person can in some way do a Shabbos Aveda, the Torah says, now you don't have to go Lifnim Mishur Sadin. You don't have to go to the ends of the earth for Shabbos Aveda. That mitzvah, by the way, has 4 corners. It has but still, how far do you go? So maybe in a circumstance where you can identify, I don't know if at the Niagara Falls you're going to be able to identify, but maybe so. So in any event, all right. So Mitchell, we'll stop here and we'll go back to next week, Mitzvah.